Hello folks, and welcome to Inquirity. This is my first video of the year, so I wanted to start things off with a bang. And I figured, what better way to start than by talking about something fundamental to science? What if I told you that the scientific method itself is flawed? And when I say flawed, I don't mean a teensy-weensy little bug that holds up research a little. I mean there's a big ol' conundrum that can cause researchers to publish false results if they're not careful. Yes, our standardized roadmap for how to do scientific research, a tool taught in elementary school, and something used by every professional scientist, has a fundamental problem. And the root of this problem is one step of the scientific method: forming a hypothesis. At first, this sounds crazy. I mean, forming a hypothesis is one of the most fundamental steps in the scientific method. How could it possibly be a problem? Well, it's not the scientific method itself that's a problem. It's more about our psychology when we develop a hypothesis. In a perfect world, the scientific method does work. You start with a question, form a hypothesis that possibly answers that question, perform experiments to test the hypothesis, review the data, and create a new hypothesis if your hypothesis was false, and publish your results if your hypothesis was true. There's some variation in this structure, so you may have heard of a slightly different version of this, but this is the basic skeleton of the scientific method that we'll use for the sake of this video. The problem is that every single researcher, no matter what, is human. People have the natural tendency to be biased towards their own ideas or preconceptions. This is known as confirmation bias. If we're following the scientific method, the process of forming a hypothesis is also setting up a preconception about how to explain the question. If confirmation bias states that we're biased towards our preconceptions, then forming a hypothesis, especially early on in a research project, can lead us to become biased towards that hypothesis in every other part of the research process. Maybe a researcher will have some data that could support their hypothesis, as well as data that could go against their hypothesis, and then they only use the supportive data in their research and try to find a way to write off the contradictory data. Or maybe a researcher will get their research reviewed by other researchers and keep the supportive reviews and not include as much of the critiques. The whole scientific method could be botched because of this preconception we formed from the beginning, leading people to publish researches that are really based more on their preconceptions instead of the facts. This is hypothesis bias. So there's our problem. Now what's the solution? Do we just not have a hypothesis? Well, of course not. Like I said earlier, forming a hypothesis is one of the most fundamental steps in the scientific method. We form a hypothesis to figure out what we're supposed to be doing experiments for. Without a hypothesis, we have no direction or idea of what to be doing next. Take for instance Sir Arthur Eddington and Sir Frank Watson Dyson, two scientists who proved Einstein's theory that space-time is warped by gravity. They proved this by taking equipment that was high-tech at the time, going to a very specific place on Earth where they could see the 1919 total solar eclipse, measured the position of certain stars around the sun that they could only see because of the solar eclipse, because the sun is just too bright, and going back a few months later to measure the positions of those same stars at night. Based on the star positions, they found out that space was in fact warped by the gravity of the sun, proving Einstein's theory. This is just such a random sequence of events that requires special equipment, planning, traveling, and knowing what to look for. It's unlikely that anyone would do anything close to this without having some form of direction. Eddington and Dyson read Einstein's theory of relativity, and their hypothesis was that he was right. This gave them an idea of what they needed to test in order to either prove or disprove their hypothesis. So getting rid of the hypothesis step is out of the question. But maybe that's not where our focus should be. The problem isn't really the process of forming a hypothesis, it's our own psychology. It's people's tendency to be biased towards a preconception. Maybe there's a way to modify the scientific method to reduce the likelihood of hypothesis bias. The scientific method has existed for thousands of years and has gone through many revisions over that time. And all those revisions cause the scientific method to reflect an ideal process of doing scientific research. Well, now I think we're at the point where, yes, we have an outline for ideal research. But now we need to modify the scientific process to better work with human psychology, which naturally has a bias to want to be right. So let's play around with the scientific method. The only things are that we have to keep the basic outline from earlier, and the changes have to be reasonable. A researcher doesn't always have access to unlimited resources, so the answer can't simply be, get more participants, more time, more funding, more reviewers. We can't do stuff like that. One proposed solution is to do background research after having a question and before developing a hypothesis. This is definitely a great idea, and adding this step would give the researcher a better understanding of the subject before coming up with a hypothesis. The problem is that this doesn't do much to make a researcher less biased towards the hypothesis. Even if you have a good understanding of a subject, you can still be biased towards your own preconception. Actually, I would even say that you could make the argument that knowing more about a subject beforehand could make someone more prone to hypothesis bias since they think of themselves as more of an expert on the subject. So background research is absolutely a great idea, but maybe not something that helps with reducing the possibility of hypothesis bias. Well, what does the internet say about confirmation bias and how to avoid it? First, we need to address the bias early on. The longer we have our preconception, and the more we invest in this preconception, the more emotionally attached we become to it, and the more likely we are to become biased towards it. So ideally, the step in the scientific method to help avoid confirmation bias should come directly after forming the hypothesis, to minimize the possibility of becoming too attached to it. The major key to help prevent confirmation bias is to open yourself up to different possibilities, including the possibility that you might be wrong. So, my proposition is to have a two-part step immediately after developing a hypothesis. This step is titled Challenge the Hypothesis. One part of the step is to ask yourself what sorts of things you will see in your data collection if your hypothesis is right, and the second part is the opposite. Ask yourself what sorts of things you will see in your data collection if your hypothesis is wrong. Then these two parts of the step come back together into the data collection step. Doing this before going any further into the scientific method primes your brain to the idea that your hypothesis could be wrong before your mind has any time to get too emotionally attached to it. Then thinking about what specific things to look for to both confirm and disprove the hypothesis helps give a clear idea on how to interpret the data if those points start showing up. And thinking of what to look for early on gives less flexibility and interpretation to the data you receive later on. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong. A lot of researchers already practice this. By no means is it a new idea. But what I'm saying is that it would help if we standardize this two-part step into the scientific method, make it a part of the skeleton, and we should teach people early on that yes, the scientific method is extremely useful, but it has its flaws and here they are. I don't know about you, but I was taught the scientific method and I never questioned it. And the point of science is to question everything. And by no means does this solution cure hypothesis bias. There's a lot of researchers out there who could go through this extra step and still be biased. And this also doesn't solve every other problem that can lead to bad research. All the suggestion is meant to do is help reduce the chances of hypothesis bias from happening. People are just naturally messy, and not a lot of changes have been made to the scientific method to help accompany this messiness. And I genuinely think that's what the next changes to the scientific method need to do. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Goodbye!